Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the ultra secret guarded, super secret HEMA technique that allows all of your thrusts to land and to never ever get parried or get undercutted in the body. And that is the flat Schiel. But if you're wondering what that is, I'll describe it really quickly here. The Schiel is a technique from which you throw a cut or a descending cut from your Vomtag, which is the position where you have your sword up by your shoulder. And you generally are told to throw it by the texts from that position towards the center line. And the idea here is that if you throw this right, you're either going to hit him on the top of the head with the edge, which means it's a cut, or you're going to slightly misrange it and you're going to land directly into long point, at which point you can come forward and stab them. And it's a really, really cool move. And it's told generally in the text that because of this kind of from the right to the middle motion, it's supposed to be used against plow. But in my opinion, there's another variation of the Schiel that works really, really well, and I call it the flat Schiel. Now, I think a lot of people already know what this is, but some people in the comments earlier didn't seem to know. So I want to maybe go a little bit into why it's good and why it's bad, and what kinds of ways that you can utilize it in a tournament format. So I'm actually going to show footage here from the end of the fight, not the beginning, but it's just because these are the two best demonstrations of the flat Schiel from exactly what I'm talking about. And I want to start with this so that I can go into the setups and payoffs later for what kinds of variations you might use. So as you see here, there really is a core tenet to the flat Schiel, and that is you start with your hands and your thumb on top of the blade, meaning that your crossguard is horizontal. And the reason you do this is because it is there to defend your hands. But more importantly, it is also there to make sure that because of your different starting position, instead of having it with the edge on in your Vomtag, you have the flat facing forward. What it allows you to do is flick your tip. And as you see here from the footage, when you do this, you get a really big bend in your sword. And it's not just from the bend that you get from stabbing somebody else. It's also because when you flick a tip against the flat of a blade, you get a little bit more of a bend than you normally would if you throw the edge forward. And what that means is that if someone is trying to parry your thrust by pushing it up and away, well, that U-shaped bend is basically going to give them a critical extra couple of inches of travel that makes it so your blade can kind of literally hook around somebody's guard. Now, this might seem a little bit gamey, but just remember that A, historical swords are indeed a little bit flexible, though obviously not to this degree, so this would still work even with a real sword, and B, that just because you're getting a couple extra inches doesn't mean it's going to magically turn a thrust that would have missed into something that lands. Generally, what it does is it allows it to kind of skip off of your target, because generally if you land and you don't have a rubber tip on your sword and you only got it because you flicked your tip in, it's going to basically bounce right back out, which does happen sometimes, but it's important to know just because sometimes you're going to get these really big dramatic flexes, and you can pretty much tell yourself that, no, it's not just because I hooked my sword like an épée fencer, it's because I was probably online the entire time. So now we're going to quite confusingly go to the actual beginning of the fight, where you'll see me try to set some of these techniques up. And you'll also notice that I am not starting out with my sword in that Vomtag position that I talked about. And in my opinion, this does make it really not a Schiel anymore, but for the purposes of explaining the Schiel, I have to talk about why you want to throw it flat. And for that, I can think of no better example than a normal thrust from a flat plow, because it helps accentuate why it is that you want your crossguard in a horizontal position. As you can see from this exchange, JJ comes in and tries to hit me in the hands, and I am able to thrust into that directly without any fear of my hands getting hit, primarily because I started in a low position and returned to a more center position, which means my crossguard was going up, but also because it was flat, my tip is pointed up, and anything that you throw at me, whether high or even a little bit low, probably going to hit my blade and end up right in my crossguard, which, if you know anything about bind mechanics, is a great place to be, even if your thrust doesn't land. As a direct result of this exchange, I am able to defend myself after JJ does successfully parry my thrust offline, and because I'm able to defend myself, I'm able to then throw another follow-up cut. And If you don't understand why it is that you can do this from this particular position, you might look at something like a flat Schiel and go, oh, your hands are undefended. I'm just going to snipe them as they come forward. But the reality is if you throw the Schiel flat, that horizontal crossguard does a lot more work than most people think in defending your hands. For our next exchange, you'll see another little variation on a setup for the flat Schiel. Now, you'll see me starting in this exact same position again, left plow, thumb on the flat of the blade, flat facing my opponent. And you'll notice that I start gesturing towards my opponent and waiting to see what kind of reaction he makes. When I notice that he doesn't really have a reaction other than backing up, I throw a fake flat Schiel or a flat thrust, and then I pivot out of it and throw a cut to the hands. And this is a really great thing to accentuate your flat thrusts because it allows you to have another form of attack off of the exact same setup and the exact same feint. If all I ever did was feint a thrust or throw a thrust, JJ wouldn't have to ever adapt to that because he could just throw the same hard parry every single time. Sure, he'd look a little silly when he threw a hard thrust against something that wasn't there, but then when I actually threw it, he'd parry it really well and probably undercut me in the body, as you'll see soon. So the fact that I'm able to throw something else off of the same setup means that not only is this something good that I can do from this exact same position, but that it doesn't necessarily ruin my edge alignment to any degree. As long as you know how to transition from thumb grip to hammer grip, you should be able to pull this off. So now we come to the fail state. What happens when these flat thrusts from a low guard don't work out? And as I will describe later, one of the disadvantageous positions of starting from a low guard is that if somebody else comes in high, they are usually able to get an advantageous bind out of the subsequent bind that happens when your swords collide. And as you see here, I throw a thrust, JJ parries it, but because of how strong his parry was, he is able to then go from what is now my high right side to my low left side and get a nice undercut straight to my body that I'm completely unable to parry. And the reason I'm unable to parry it is because when he throws his parry, he puts his strong into the middle of his torso, right about the level of his shoulders, which is going to be the middle of my sword. And that is exactly because my hands were low when they started. What you have to understand is that your starting position means a lot in terms of how your thrust is going to land and how it's going to be parried. And in my opinion, throwing these flat thrusts from plow can work really, really well, but they're not quite as good as throwing them from that Vom-Tog position. Despite the fact that you have the same hand protection of a flat crossguard, it's not quite enough when it comes to bind mechanics in the mid-game. Now you'll see me adapt my guard. I am no longer staying in my flat plow position. My guard is different now and it's pointed up a little bit towards the ceiling. This is not what I would consider a Vom-Tog, but it's also not a plow. And what you really want to call it is what I think most people would call a lazy Vom-Tog. But I'm going to call it a Vom-Tog simply because, in my opinion, the key differences between this and the previous guard is that my point is no longer in line with my opponent. And in my opinion, this is actually not a great place to be either. As you'll see from this exchange, my opponent comes in, throws a really hard cut to my headline, and because my hands are so low, even though my guard is kind of pointed up, I'm not able to get a really great juicy cron parry out of that attack, which means when I throw what would normally be my left Zwerg and now is my right Zwerg, I'm not able to quite make it all the way and my opponent is able to parry. At which point they pull off and do the classic JJ of go low and cut me straight in the body. So what we see here is while the flat Schiel could have really saved me in this situation, and if you noticed from a clip earlier, did save me in this situation, I am not quite there yet where I've gotten my Schiel to the right starting position. Now the next clip is really important because it shows how these adjustments in my stances are starting to have some real effects on how these exchanges are going. Now I am back into my lazy Vom-Tog, but you'll notice that my tip is a little bit more towards my opponent's head. And this comes in greatly in handy when I throw yet another flat Schiel. Now you'll notice that physics-wise, it's not entirely different from the flat thrust that I was throwing from plow, given that my hand motion is kind of the same. But one of the advantages that having my tip in the air gives me is that flicking thrust. And you'll notice that when I almost make contact with JJ's body here with that thrust, there's quite a good bit of bend in my guard. And what that's telling me is that I'm getting closer and closer to actually landing my thrusts. And most importantly, I'm getting closer and closer because I'm able to put my sword in an advantageous position both offensively and defensively. You'll see here that JJ once again tries to hit me in the hands as I'm coming in, and that flat crossguard completely saves my life. It is the only reason I did not get sniped in the hands on the way in, and you'll notice it happens on my offside. Despite the fact that I was not really ready for such a hand shot, previously I had only defended such a hand shot on my left side. So the fact that this can do both is really great defensively. Again, not only for when you land those thrusts, but when you fail to land those thrusts, and you have to make sure that your hands are safe. So we come now to the final iteration of the setups. You've seen before where I'm starting to angle my guard a little bit more towards my opponent's head, and here it's maybe just pointed ever so slightly above their head, meaning that I get all the advantages of being able to defend my upper openings. I get the advantage of my horizontal crossguard, which means my hands can't easily be sniped as I'm coming forward, and I get that flicking tip effect where I can maybe get over the guard of my opponent if they decide to parry my thrusts by going up high. So we have all of our advantages, but we have one more thing to talk about, and that is setups, because what you see here in this exchange is I come forward and I do the exact same gesture that I would do, aka flick my tip forward, if I was going to throw that flat shield how, and my opponent responds by trying to parry what they thought was a flat shield how. At which point, I find that I'm pretty easily able to pull out of it, go back into a kind of cron parry that with my arms extended, and then throw that exact same hand cut that we saw a couple exchanges ago. So what's important to note here is that if I can do the exact same setups and the exact same payoffs with this high Vomtog or this lazy Vomtog as I can from that low flat plow, then there's really no reason to start from the low flat plow other than it keeps my tip a little bit more in line. And there is some advantages to this, but in my opinion, I've pretty much removed any of the advantages that I was getting from the particular techniques I was doing and transferred them all into this new guard and this new starting position and have gotten some new advantages to take care of. So we're back now to the final exchange of the match. I am 2 points away from winning the match, and JJ comes in with another high line cut to my head. And this is where we'll get into the final little tip that I'll have for flat shield house, and that is the shield how traditionally tells you that you're supposed to go from a guard that is on the side of your body, aka, on the left side or on your right shoulder or something like that, and then cross into the middle. And this is a really good idea if you're trying to zone out somebody's long guard. For example, if you're standing in the flat plow that you saw me stand in the beginning of this fight, throwing a shield how from the side to the middle is a really, really great way to push my blade out of the way and stab me right in the chest. You get all the same advantages of the high shield how. You flick over the top. I'm probably going to try to cron parry, which means you'll have a great U-shaped sword that's going to make it really hard for me to push away. All the advantages, but one disadvantage is that left or right to middle side kind of movement is not great when someone is coming in with a cut. As you see here, JJ throws a cut on my left side, and I am starting off on my left side more or less. And the problem here is that when I would normally cross my body line by starting from my left and going to the middle, I start on my left and stay on my left. And that's a very, very important thing to take note of, because what you have to make sure of is that your ending position and your starting position are kind of in line with each other. And the reason that's important is because it gives you really, really good structure in that parry, and it takes full advantage of that horizontal crossguard. If you are trying to parry a cut to your hands and you are moving from left to right or from right to left, you are exposing one of your forearms by doing so. Meaning that when someone is throwing a big cut, either to your head in this instance or to your hands, you want to make sure that you're keeping your shield house in line with that attack, not in line with some arbitrary center line that you think is necessarily safer. As you probably know if you've thrusted anyone before in your life, any deviation from the center line can allow both you or your opponent to land your attack, which means oftentimes double thrusts happen when somebody goes offline and the other person takes a center line. But it can definitely happen if both people take opposite lines. So in this case, you want to make sure that your thrust is on the same line as your opponent's cut. Otherwise, going to the center will simply leave you open and result in a double. So if you think that this flat Schiel how is some magic solution, it's not, obviously. There are still some serious problems with it. But in my opinion, it's something that everyone should at least try to do once or twice as a mix-up in their own thrust game. And I think they'll find that there's a lot of advantages to be gained from starting from these weird positions, especially when it comes to fencing people who maybe know how to deal with a long point style guard. But if you think I'm just a dirty little sport fencer and I'm trying to bring epee flicks into HEMA, feel free to write me a paragraph. Otherwise, I will see you next week.